Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're really glad to have all of you. I know it's final season, so particularly in light of that, thanks for everyone who came out. Today, we are very fortunate to have a incredible and thought-provoking guest joining us, Mr. Jason Riley. But before I introduce Jason Riley, I would like to talk about the Buckley program, who we are, what we do, and things of that sort. So the Buckley program was founded several years ago by a group of Yale undergraduates, one of whom, Laura Noble, is right here. She's our executive director. And they strove to promote intellectual diversity and expand political discourse at Yale. Since then, the program has grown to host a number of guests, a vibrant and dynamic speaker series. We have a blog, we fund summer internships, we host seminars, and pretty much many other things that fit within our mission of expanding political discourse at Yale. Today, we are very excited to host, as I said, Mr. Jason Riley. Mr. Riley joined the Wall Street Journal in 1994 and worked his way up to being a member of their editorial board. He is also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, in addition to being a regular commentator on Fox News. I could say much more, but I would rather let Mr. Riley get into his talk and describe both his book and just his various thoughts on the subject of today's lecture. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Jason Riley.
Great. I don't need to use that, do I?
Yeah.
I'm all set? Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank all of you for braving the weather to show up here today. I also want to thank the Buckley program for putting on this lecture series. I echo the sentiment that intellectual diversity at college campuses today is something in relatively short supply. I can attest to that from spending a lot of time traveling around the country to these various college campuses, and judging from the reaction I get, I think more Buckley programs are needed at more schools. So I applaud what you're doing here, and thank you again for inviting me to speak. My first book was about immigration. This book is about race. I picked the easy subjects, the ones that bring us together as a country. But we're still only a couple months into 2015, into a new year, and it's a very important year in civil rights history because 2015 marks the 50th anniversary of what may be Martin Luther King's most significant achievement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination based on race and gender and religion and gave blacks access to jobs and schools and public facilities that previously had been closed off to them. But access to the voting booth, access to the ballot, was still, of course, a challenge for blacks, particularly in the South. And President Lincoln said we're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but that's only true if all the people can register and vote. The ability to vote, of course, is what protects all the other freedoms that we enjoy in this country. It's how we elect or hold our officials, our elected officials, accountable and responsible for the decisions they make. So after the Civil Rights Act passed, Dr. King pressed for a Voting Rights Act 2, and 50 years ago this summer, President Johnson signed it. And it's been a huge success. Just to give you a sense of how successful the Voting Rights Act has been, in 1964, the year before it passed, fewer than 7% of blacks were registered to vote in the state of Mississippi, the lowest percentage in the South. But by 1966, just 1 year after the Voting Rights Act passed, the black voter registration rate in Mississippi had climbed to 60%, the highest in the South. And Mississippi was no outlier. In Georgia, it went from 19% to 51%. In fact, in every southern state, the gains were striking. Today, black voter registration in the South, where most blacks still live, is higher than it is in other parts of the country. And in 2012, the last presidential election year, the black voter turnout rate in America was higher than the white voter turnout rate for the first time in US history. That's how successful the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been. Along with the Civil Rights Act, it's represented the culmination of a modern-day civil rights movement. And what I wanted to talk about this evening is what's happened in the wake of these civil rights victories in terms of black culture, black behavior, what's risen from the ruins of Jim Crow in terms of policies aimed at helping the black underclass. Where has there been progress? Where has there been retrogression? What's working, what's not working, and how much of what's not working can be blamed on residual racism? Thomas Sowell, a black economist at Stanford, and one of the people I dedicated my book to, once said that some books you write for pleasure and some you write out of a sense of duty, because there are things that need to be said and other people who have better sense than to say them out loud. This book falls into that latter category for me. When I started out as a journalist 20 years ago, I had no expectation of focusing on race-related topics per se. People like Tom Sowell and Shelby Steele and Walter Williams and a few other independent black thinkers, to my mind at least, had already said what needed to be said, had been saying it for decades and said it much more eloquently than I ever could. But over the years, and with some prodding from those guys, it struck me that not enough younger blacks were following in their footsteps. It also occurred to me that many of the public policies aimed at the black underclass were just as wrong-headed as they'd ever been. The fight wasn't over, and a new generation of black thinkers and writers needed to explain what was working, what was not working, and why to a new generation of readers. And the result is the book, Please Stop Helping Us, which I hope will add another voice to these debates, and hopefully in a way that brings more light than heat to the discussion of race in this country. Now, the book's not an autobiography or a memoir, but I do include a few anecdotes about growing up black and male in the inner city. And one of the stories involves a trip back home to Buffalo, New York, where I was born and raised. I was visiting my older sister shortly after I began working at the Wall Street Journal. And I was chatting with her daughter, my niece, who was maybe in second grade at the time. I was asking her about school, her favorite subjects, that sort of thing. When she stopped me, and she said, "Uncle Jason, why you talk white?" And she turned to her little friend who was sitting there with her and said, "Don't my uncle sound white? Why are you trying to sound so smart?" Now, she was just teasing, of course, and I smiled, and they enjoyed a little chuckle at my expense. But what she said stayed with me. I couldn't help thinking, here were two young black girls, 7 or 8 years old, already linking speech patterns to race and intelligence. They already had a rather sophisticated awareness that as blacks, white-sounding speech was not only to be avoided in their own speech, but mocked in the speech of others. Now, I shouldn't have been too surprised by this and I wasn't. My siblings, along with countless other black friends and relatives, teased me the same way when I was growing up, and other black professionals have told similar stories. What I had forgotten is just how early these attitudes take hold, how soon this counterproductive thinking and behavior begins. New York City, where I work, has the largest school system in America, and 80% of black kids in New York City public schools are performing below grade level. And a big part of the problem is a black subculture that rejects attitudes and behaviors that are conducive to academic success. Black kids read half as many books and watch twice as much television as their white counterparts, for example. In other words, a big part of the problem is a culture that produces little black girls and boys who are already worried about acting and sounding white by the time they are in second grade. Another big part of the problem is a reluctance to speak honestly about this subculture and its shortcomings. Many whites fear being called racist. Many blacks fear being called racial traitors. And many black leaders have a vested interest in blaming black problems primarily on white racism. So that is the narrative they push, regardless of the reality. Racism has become an all-purpose explanation for bad black outcomes, be they social or economic. If you disagree and are white, you are a bigot. If you disagree and are black, you're a sellout. Too often, this is the level of discourse. Schoolyard name-calling, ad hominem attacks aimed at shutting down the debate. The shooting death of a young black man by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri last year touched off a national discussion about everything except the aberrant behavior of so many young black men that results in such frequent encounters with police. We talked about racial prejudice, poverty, unemployment, the tensions between law enforcement and poor black communities, and so forth. Rarely did you hear any discussion of black crime rates. Homicide is the leading cause of death for young black men in the United States. And around 90% of the perpetrators in those homicides are also black. Yet for months, we had protesters running around the country pretending that our morgues are full of young black men because cops are shooting them. Not because other blacks are shooting them, which is the norm. Around 98% of black shooting deaths do not involve police. In fact, a cop is 6 times more likely to be shot by someone black than the opposite. The protesters were pushing a false anti-cop narrative, and everyone from the president on down was playing along. Any candid debate on race and the criminal justice system in this country would have to start with the fact that blacks commit an astoundingly disproportionate number of crimes. Blacks constitute about 13% of the population. Yet between 1976 and 2005, they committed more than half of all murders in the United States, an absolute majority. The black arrest rate for most offenses, including robbery, aggravated assault, and property crimes, even white-collar crimes, is typically 2 to 3 times their representation in the population. So long as blacks are committing such an outsized amount of crime, young black men will be viewed suspiciously by blacks and whites alike, and tensions between the police and crime-ridden communities will persist. The U.S. criminal justice system is a reflection of this reality, not its cause. And if we want to change negative perceptions of young black men, we have to change the behavior that is driving those perceptions. But pointing this out has become almost taboo. How can we even begin to address problems if we won't discuss them honestly? Some people want to blame these outcomes on racial animus and poverty. But back in the 1940s and 50s, when racial discrimination was rampant and legal, and black poverty was much higher than today, the black crime rate was lower. Some want to blame these outcomes on the system or systemic racism. But blacks have long been a part of running that system. Black crime and incarceration rates spiked in the 1970s and 80s in cities such as Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago and Philadelphia under black mayors and black police chiefs and black city councilmen and black state legislators. Some of the most violent cities in the U.S. today are run by black people. Some insist that our jails and prisons are teeming with young black men, due primarily to racist drug laws. But does the evidence support that? It's worth remembering that the harsher penalties for crack cocaine offenses that were passed in the 1980s were supported by a majority of the Congressional Black Caucus, including Representative Charles Rangel, who at the time headed the House Committee on Narcotics Abuse. Crack was destroying black communities, and many black political leaders wanted the dealers to face longer sentences. In other words, it was black legislators in Washington who led the effort to impose tougher drug laws, a fact that is often conveniently omitted by critics today. When these laws passed, even the opponents in Congress didn't claim they were racist. Those charges came later, as the racial impact of the laws became apparent. But what's been lost in this discussion is whether these laws leave law-abiding blacks, who are the majority of blacks in these communities, worse off or better off. Do you make life harder or easier in the ghetto by sending the thugs home sooner rather than later? Liberals would have us deny what black ghetto residents know to be the truth. These communities aren't dangerous because of racist cops or judges or sentencing guidelines. These communities are dangerous mainly due to black criminals preying on black victims. Nor is the racial disparity in prison inmates explained by the enforcement of drug laws. Blacks are about 37% of the population in our prison system. Remove the drug offenders from that population, and blacks are still right about 37% of the inmates in our prison system. What drives black incarceration rates are violent offenses, not drug offenses. Blacks commit violent crimes at 7 to 10 times the rate that whites do. The fact that their victims tend to be of the same race suggests that young black men in the ghetto live in danger of being shot by each other, not by cops. Nor is this a function of blacks being picked on by cops who are over-policing certain neighborhoods. Research has long shown that the rate at which blacks are arrested is nearly identical to the rate at which crime victims identify their perpetrators as being black. The police in these communities are there because that is where the 9/11 calls originate. If we want to help reverse these trends, we would do better to focus less on the supposed racial animus of the system and more on attitudes in these communities towards school, work, marriage, child rearing, and so forth, focusing on cultural issues, that is. But again, this too has become almost taboo. Even when the President of the United States, as he has done on several occasions, talks about black culture, he gets shot down by his liberal allies who want the focus kept on white racism. Since becoming president, Obama has on a number of occasions talked about the breakdown of the black family and its larger consequences. He spoke at Morehouse, a black college in Atlanta, a couple years ago, and he said, "I was raised by a heroic single mother and wonderful grandparents who made incredible sacrifices for me, but I still wish I had a father who was not only present, but involved. And so my whole life, I've tried to be for Michelle and my girls what my father wasn't for my mother and me. I've tried to be a better father, a better husband, a better man." He told those black men in the audience to be a good role model for other, less fortunate black men. He said, brothers who have been left behind, who haven't had the same opportunities that we have, they need to hear from us. We need to be in the barbershops with them, at church with them, helping to pull them up, exposing them to new opportunities. We have to teach them what it means to be a man. That's what Obama told college graduates in Morehouse. Now that might sound like common sense to you and me. In fact, some people in this room might wish that that's all Obama would ever talk about. But again, he gets slammed by the black left when he raises these cultural issues because he's seen as criticizing black culture and letting whites off the hook. But Obama has the facts on his side when he raises these cultural issues. As recently as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 black children were raised in 2-parent homes. Today, more than 70% are not. and the number goes as high as 80 or 90% in some of our inner cities. For decades, studies have shown that the likelihood of teen pregnancy, drug abuse, dropping out of school, and many other bad social outcomes increases dramatically when fathers aren't around. One of the most comprehensive studies ever done in this area concluded that black boys without a father were 68% more likely to be incarcerated than those with a father. The study said that overall, the most critical factor affecting the prospect that a male youth will encounter the criminal justice system is the presence of a father in his home. All other factors, including family income, are much less important. The political scientist James Q. Wilson put it this way: if crime is to a significant degree caused by weak character, if weak character is more likely among children of unmarried mothers, if there are no fathers who will help raise their children, acquire jobs, protect their neighborhoods, if boys become young men with no preparation for work, if school achievement is regarded as a sign of having sold out, if all these things are true, then the chances of reducing the crime rate among low-income blacks anytime soon is slim. Many people sincerely want to help the black underclass in this country. The problem, as I see it, is that they believe a bigger, more expansive government or a government program is the way to go. But having looked at the track record of government policies aimed at helping the black underclass, I'm extremely skeptical of taking this route. This year also marks the 50th anniversary of President Johnson's speech at Howard University, the black college in Washington, D.C., where he launched the Great Society programs. Johnson had just signed the Civil Rights Act a year earlier, and he'd signed the Voting Rights Act a few months later. And he used the speech to talk about what government should do next on behalf of black America. This is merely the end of the beginning, he said, quoting Churchill. And then he said, the beginning is freedom. And the barriers to that freedom are tumbling down. Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society, to vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school, said Johnson. But freedom is not enough. He added, you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him and bring him up to the starting line of a race and say, you're free to compete with all the others, and think you've been completely fair to that person. Johnson said the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights was not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. But what if Johnson was mistaken? What if there are limits to what the government can do beyond removing barriers to freedom? What if the best that we can hope for from our elected officials are policies that promote equal opportunity? What if public policymakers risk creating more barriers and more problems when the goal is equal outcomes? In 1988, right around the 25th anniversary of the Great Society, Nathan Glazer, the Harvard sociologist, published a book called The Limits of Social Policy. Glazer was analyzing the Great Society programs from the perspective of someone who believed that government action was the best way to improve the lot of blacks. But his assessment humbled him. He said that government programs aren't the solution to many of these problems. He said that in many ways, the Great Society programs were causing just as many problems as they were solving. He said good intentions aren't enough. But unlike Nathan Glazer, many policymakers today are still riding high on those good intentions. They don't seem particularly interested in reconsidering what has been tried. Even though 50 years into the war on poverty, the picture is not pretty. While gains have been made, significant racial disparities remain in some areas, and black retrogression has occurred in other areas. The black-white poverty gap has widened over the past decade, and black poverty is no longer falling in this country. The black-white disparity in incarceration rates today is larger than it was in 1960. And the black unemployment rate on average has been double the white unemployment rate for 50 years. Confronted with these statistics, some continue pushing for the same solutions that clearly haven't worked. President Obama announced yet another federal initiative aimed at helping the black underclass last year, calling for more preschool education, even though studies, including those released by his own administration, have shown no significant impact on education from such programs. He said he wants to increase reading proficiency and graduation rates for minority students, yet he opposes school voucher programs that are doing both. He wants to raise the minimum wage, even though there's long been a strong correlation between higher black unemployment and a higher minimum wage. For the president and many who think like him, empirical data seem to take a back seat, again, to good intentions. And then there's crime. After George Zimmerman was acquitted in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, President Obama explained the black response to the verdict this way. They understand, said the president, referring to blacks, that some of the violence that takes place in poor black neighborhoods around the country is born out of a very violent past. And the poverty and dysfunction that we see in those communities can be traced to a very difficult history. Obama was doing exactly what liberalism has been conditioning blacks to do since the 1960s, which is to blame black pathology on the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. But ultimately, this is a dodge. Those legacies are not holding down blacks half as much as the legacies of efforts to help blacks. This sentimental support has turned underprivileged blacks into playthings for intellectuals and politicians who care much more about clearing their conscience or winning votes than they do in advocating behaviors and attitudes that have allowed other groups to get ahead in this country. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement has become an industry that does little more than monetize white guilt. Martin Luther King and his contemporaries demanded self-improvement despite the abundant and overt racism of their day. King once told a congregation in St. Louis, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population of St. Louis and are responsible for 58% of its crimes? We've got to face that," he said, "and we've got to do something about our moral standards." He said, "We know there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man," said King. "There are things we must do for ourselves." I used those statements from King in an article I wrote in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago. And some readers wrote in accusing me of making up the quotes, which came from a profile of King that appeared in Harper's Weekly in 1961. Now, I was a little taken aback by the accusation, and not just because the Harper's piece can be located and read without too much trouble on Google. But what really struck me about the accusation is that those making it apparently just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way about problems facing the black community and the role of personal responsibility, which might tell you all you need to know about the quality of what passes for black leadership today. King's successors, living in an era when public policy bends over backwards to accommodate blacks, nevertheless insist that blacks cannot be held responsible for their plight so long as racial prejudice exists in this country. But the more fundamental problem with these well-meaning efforts to help blacks is that they have succeeded tragically in convincing blacks to see themselves first and foremost as victims. Today, there is no greater impediment to black advancement than the self-pitying mindset that permeates black subculture. White liberals think they are helping blacks by romanticizing bad behavior. And black liberals are all too happy to hustle these guilty whites. Blacks ultimately must help themselves, I believe. They must develop the same attitudes and behaviors and habits that other groups had to develop in order to rise in America. And to the extent that a social policy, however well-intentioned, interferes with this self-development, it does more harm than good. This concept of self-help and self-development is something that black leaders once understood all too well in this country, and at a time when blacks faced infinitely more obstacles than they face today. Frederick Douglass said in 1865 that everyone kept asking him and the other abolitionists what to do with blacks after the Civil War. He said, I've had one answer from the beginning: do nothing with us. He said, you've already played enough mischief with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. All I ask is that you give him a chance to stand on his own two legs. The rest is up to us. Douglass was essentially saying, give blacks equal opportunity and then leave us alone. Decades later, Booker T. Washington would share that sentiment. He said, it is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercise of these privileges once we have them. Douglass and Washington didn't play down the need for the government to secure equal rights for blacks, and both were optimistic that blacks would get equal rights eventually, though neither man lived to see that day. But both men also understood the limits of government benevolence. Blacks would have to ready themselves to meet the far bigger challenge of being in a position to take advantage of opportunities once equal rights had been secured. The history of the 1960s liberal social policies is largely a history of ignoring that wisdom. I'll stop there and take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Hi. So I wanted to know, is this on? Oh, okay. Okay. Which policies specifically would you attribute to the retrogression in, let's say, like the black family or things like that? So you talked more generally about the 1960s, and I just want to know like more like, I guess, concrete examples that you could give for like exactly what happened.
Well, you had policies under the Great Society programs launched then, or expanded, that, for example, penalized mothers who allowed the father of the child to live at home. You were punished if the father of your child lived in the home. They gave you no money. They would give you money if the father was kept away. There's one example. Open-ended welfare benefits in general do not encourage a group to develop a work ethic, which is ultimately what your group must develop in order to rise in this country and become independent. Again, in the name of helping, these policies were put in place, but I believe they put in place consequently disincentives or incentives that that encourage counterproductive behavior, and I think that has had a huge impact on the black family. I'll give you a statistic that a lot of people aren't aware of. The black poverty rate for married couples in this country is in the single digits and has been for more than 20 years. There's your anti-poverty program. We don't need slave reparations. We don't need a new, huge government wealth redistribution scheme. We need people to get married before before they have children. It's the surest way of staying out of poverty. Anyone else? You say that, though, self-hating, blaming the victim. All kinds of condemnation will rain down on you.
That actually leads pretty well into my question. Like recently, you've been attacked with various Salon articles I saw on Slate too, saying like how like, Fox News new race guru is like a danger to all the gains that have been made in the black community. How do you see that, like, the issue, since you can't talk about the issue from any sort of opposing viewpoint, like, do you see any possible way forward where if you don't agree with what Al Sharpton says or Jesse Jackson, how can you speak up? And
Well, I think to some extent, people who still look to a Jesse Jackson or an Al Sharpton as a leader in the black community are probably lost to their minds being changed in any fundamental way. But I do think a younger generation is open to an alternative perspective on how to move forward in these areas, and which gets back to the Buckley program and their willingness to invite alternative points of view onto campus to speak to young people about these issues. But it is a huge problem. You have a black civil rights establishment that has its own agenda, and that agenda is not, or it's almost never, does it coincide with the actual needs of the people they claim to represent. I mentioned in passing school choice in my comments. There's an issue that has pulled off the charts in the black community for decades. Black parents are the biggest supporters of school vouchers of any group in the country. Yet the NAACP and Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson vehemently oppose giving poor blacks access to better schools via vouchers. That has nothing to do with, their stance has nothing to do with the expressed desire of the black people they speak on the behalf of. That has everything to do with their own agenda, namely them taking a lot of money from teachers' unions who oppose school choice. But there's an example after example of that. You have Walmart has been trying to build a store in a poor black neighborhood in Brooklyn for years. Black lawmakers, black political representatives, all oppose Walmart doing this. Poor community, people need the jobs, they need the low-priced goods and services. The black left opposes Walmart building this store because the unions oppose Walmart building this store, because Walmart's won't organize its workers. So you have a black left out there who would rather people in this community stay unemployed than work at a Walmart. Again, the agendas of the leadership, the actual needs of the black underclass, night and day.
And just one more question.
Yeah.
Who do you see as a possible, like, 2016 presidential candidate that would put more of a focus on these issues that you've brought up? Or do you see anyone in the black community that, I don't know, like Ben Carson probably won't run and might not be suitable to run, but someone like him who has the courage or to voice these differing opinions?
I don't think what ails the black community will be solved in Washington or by a politician in general. As I've said before, a black man in the White House is all well and good, but it's no substitute for a black man in the home. And ultimately, it is the black family has to be reconstituted. And again, it's about getting the black family back to where it used to be. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There was a time not all that long ago when the black family was in much, much better shape than it is today. And I think that will be the beginning of solving a lot of these social problems. It won't, the solutions aren't going to come from lawmakers. And I don't even think the black community needs another Martin Luther King figure or some great leader. This is about the day-to-day hard work in communities. I think the church will play a role, black church will play a role. It's one of the few viable institutions in many of these poor communities. So, but I think it's going to come from people on the ground working in these communities and getting the job done that way. And that is happening. You don't hear a lot about that partly because of my profession, which continues to run to the Al's and the Jessies to speak on behalf of Black America on every issue that comes down the pike. But this work is happening, and I'm confident it will continue.
What do you see as the future of Black America as opposed to what you hope it would be?
I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, I think that one bright spot, I am an optimist, one bright spot is education, and this charter school movement that we've seen in the past couple decades, it is getting bigger. As it gets bigger, you create a natural constituency, people who will go out and support it going forward for the next generation. And it's showing that it's not the kids, it's the schools. It's showing that these kids can learn. Even kids from the most difficult backgrounds can learn, can succeed, can go to college, can graduate, can become productive citizens. And I'm confident, I'm hopeful that that will continue, because I think education is another important factor in this. In a sense, it goes hand in hand with culture. You can have the best schools in the world, but if a group does not value education, it's not going to do you much good. So it does still need to start with changing these attitudes, the acting white phenomenon, and so forth. That's got to change so that Blacks can take advantage of these educational opportunities that are out there.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for coming to talk with all of us today. I just have, how do you see the Black community rising up with the history of exclusion and discrimination and the lack of resources in the Black community? And also, what sort of cultural pathology are you suggesting that Blacks emulate in order to rise up in society?
Okay. Well, I'll say this. I would point to what was going on in the Black community prior to the 1960s. If you look back, I'll give you another quick data point. Between 1940 and 1960, Black poverty in America fell by 40 percentage points. Before a Voting Rights Act, before a Civil Rights Act, before any major civil rights legislation, before affirmative action and quotas and so forth. Black poverty in America fell by 40 percentage points over a 20-year period. That drop has never been replicated by any government program put in place to help Black people. Now, the Black poverty rate continued to fall after the civil rights legislation of the 60s passed, but at a much slower rate. At best, it continued a trend already in place. Poverty is not the only thing that was going on, or I should say coming out of poverty was not the only thing that was going on in Black America during this time period. In the 1940s and 50s, you had higher Black labor participation rates in this country than you have today. So at a time when you could put a sign in your store window that says, "We do not hire Blacks," you had lower Black unemployment and higher Black labor participation rates. You had Blacks entering the skilled professions at a higher rate in the decades leading up to the 1960s than you did in the decades following the implementation of affirmative action in the 1970s. You had Blacks increasing their levels of education, both in absolute terms and relative to whites, in the periods at a faster rate in the periods before the 1960s. Again, all of this was happening at a time when racial discrimination was rampant in this country. So the idea that it's not happening today due to residual racism, I don't think stands up to scrutiny.
Just one follow-up question. When you consider that a lot of those things that you said were like completely true. But when you consider that a lot of the black participation in the black labor participation rate had a lot to do with the heavy amounts of African Americans in industry jobs, which eventually, when our nation took more of a turn towards service-related, took a turn to a more service-related industry, which blacks were historically not allowed to participate in, um, the black labor participation rate dropped drastically. And I also, when considering liberal policies, it is true that a lot of liberal policies haven't done as much as they could for the black community. But would you say that liberal policies are the problem instead of white supremacist attitudes that have infiltrated liberal policies, such as when you look at the backlash politics that started around the 1940s with the whole Southern strategy that did a lot of appealing to racist white voters and racist sentiments, such as that formed a white coalition that sort of worked against black interests.
That's the question.
No. When you consider racist backlash against white progress that effectively gutted the Civil Rights Act by criminalizing black behavior and by criminalizing just behavior in general. We have a lot more crime laws now than we did before 1970 that have led to the mass incarceration state that we have today.
Can you give me an example
Of
an anti-black crime law?
just the war just not explicitly anti-black, but the whole implementing policies that adversely and disproportionately negatively affect black communities, such as the war on drugs.
Did you hear my comments in the
I did.
talk? You didn't.
Yes.
You did.
Yes.
Well, I addressed the war on drugs and the argument that it's anti-black, or that it's the reason the black incarceration rate is what it is today. As I said in the talk, the Congressional Black Caucus led the way in passing these laws, not white supremacists. As I said in the talk, if you could snap your fingers and send home everyone incarcerated today who's there for a drug offense, the percentage of blacks in prison would barely budge at all. So I'd ask you for evidence that racist drug laws are producing black incarceration rates.
You can see when you look at the percentage of people arrested for drug crimes, even though studies show that black drug users only account for about 14% of our population.
I think we're just talking in circles. Drug offenses don't drive the black crime rate. Drug offenses don't drive the black incarceration rate.
Drug offenses aren't the sole driver of black crime rates, but you can't...
Violent offenses drive the black incarceration rate by far. It's not even close.
I feel like your analysis really ignores a lot of historical discrimination and the levels of poverty in black communities. And also just looking at a lot of the rise in the income levels of black...
There are other people in line. You've been up here for a while, so maybe.
Okay.
I do address all this in the book, though, with footnotes, so you can look up the original studies as well.
Before I talk, I just have a confession. I am a liberal, but I came with an open mind today. First off, I want to thank the William F. Buckley Jr. Group for hosting this, and I want to thank you, sir, for your talk. But just to follow up about what I think he was trying to get to was right now in the Senate, there is consensus that the drug laws do disproportionately affect black people. Both Cory Booker and Rand Paul have a bill in the Senate right now called the Redeem Act that wants to decriminalize non-violent offenses to try to give people a second chance. So that's the first thing I do want to say. But one thing that I personally agree with you on was you called it black subculture, or this collective consciousness, social psychology in the black community where we kind of look down upon being educated or trying to follow a path that isn't cohesive with what we know to be glamorous, such as maybe being a drug dealer or what we see as successful in our own small neighborhoods in the inner cities of America. So one thing I will agree with you on is that needs to change, the social conscience of black people. How would you say we can go about actually changing the pathology of thinking in the black community to make people want to actually strive to do better and change the overall status quo of black America?
Well, I think one way is by not romanticizing bad behavior, but criticizing it in no uncertain terms. Not explaining it away, not saying it's due to legacy of this or the legacy of that, but saying it's wrong, we need to take personal responsibility for this. And I think stigmatizing it socially is one way to go. And that's not done. Unfortunately, that is not what happens today. But to your first point, no one disagrees that certain laws disproportionately affect blacks. The laws against murder disproportionately affect blacks because blacks are committing murders more often than whites. In absolute terms, in that sense. But where other crimes, it's way out of proportion their numbers in the population. There's no disagreement over whether something that is against the law disproportionately affects the people who tend to break the law. That's not the issue. The issue is whether these laws were racist in their intent when they were put in place or not with respect to the drug laws. And again, I'd say that
you refer to the Congressional Black Caucus.
the Congressional Black Caucus
right.
led the way in the sentencing disparity that Cory Booker is trying to change.
Him and Rand Paul.
And Paul as well.
Rand Paul as well. And one more thing I wanted to talk about that I think this gentleman wanted to refer to was the poverty. So I want to just give you one example because I want to really make it real, kind of like the current situation that black America is in. And we can even see right here in New Haven, right across the street from this school, right across from Elm Street, you see like a lot of what we're talking about here today, the current state of black America. So if you're born into a home that's impoverished, even if you have a mother and a father, but they're barely making ends meet, and your parents would much rather see you play an active role in helping the household, so they might encourage you to get a job. Or if you can't get a job because you already did something, you have a criminal record and no one wants to hire you, you start selling drugs. How can you kind of like negate all these different variables that do affect black people and do, in a way, kind of keep them in this second-class citizenship place that by a lot of things that are kind of out of their control. That young kid who's born in that situation, that's totally out of his control.
I think you're confusing cause and effect. What I'm saying is that at a time when black poverty was much, much higher than today, you did not have the crime rate in the black community that you have today. You did not have that in the 1940s and 30s and 50s.
And what I'm telling you is, and like he said, during those decades, our manufacturing industry in this country was large enough that we could do jobs not a lot of other people wanted to do, or there was so much work people were willing to do those jobs. So like for instance, I'm from Rochester, New York, and a lot of older African Americans there will tell you about when they started hiring blacks at Kodak or Xerox or Bosch and Lomb. Those jobs don't exist today. The job market is extremely competitive today.
Those jobs don't exist for anybody today. It's not just blacks who have been affected by the decline of the manufacturing industry.
But you use that as an example to show how black poverty was less in those times. There was more participation in black labor during that period of time.
That's because you're connecting poverty to black pathologies. And I'm saying if poverty is the factor in driving other black pathologies. Why, when there was more black poverty, much more than we have today, did we not have these other pathologies? If poverty is the main factor.
Why? Because today, so like we talk about when these drug laws were first introduced, or these non-violent offensive laws were introduced, and you had people disqualifying themselves to participate in the labor force. People are going to survive. If I have to sell drugs, if I have to steal, I'm going to try to make a way for myself and my family. And I think you're not really equating that variable in your ideology when you talk about why we are where we are today. And that has developed this social conscience where we have begun to glorify things that I don't think should be glorified, such as the drug culture or the thug culture or many various other cultures you see play out in the black narrative today. But two things, I think we do have to address that pathology, that social psychology, but I also think we have to just take into note that poverty does play a vital role. And until we can address the economic disparities in the black community, we're always going to somehow subject ourselves to this alternative economy, if you will, of crime, drugs, prostitution, and the other things that you see in America's inner city, because people have to survive.
Okay, I'll give you the last word. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
You talked about your family and your niece and maybe other members of your family who ridiculed you for talking white. I wondered if you would share with us the influences, both family and otherwise, that affected your career path and led you to where you are today.
Well, my parents were divorced when I was quite young. But my father was always very much a presence in my life. You know, he had visitation 3-4 times a week, weekends, holidays, things like that. So although I grew up technically in a single-parent home, my father was very much a presence in my life, coaching Little League Baseball, that sort of thing. And I think that had a huge impact on me and viewing him as a role model. My mother was also very religious, and so I spent a lot of time in the church, which was full of black men who dressed in suits and took care of their families and wore shirts and ties when I saw them at services and so forth. So I was really surrounded by black role models growing up, and I think that had a huge impact. Now, but again, there were different outcomes even within my own family, with my siblings, let alone my extended family. So, so that only can explain so much. But if I had to point to something that I think had a huge impact on me, it would be my father. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument that policy has adversely affected culture, but I want to address this. The phrasing and the language that people on both sides of the aisle keep using about the black community and black culture in America. And I kind of want to ask, to what extent is that an oversimplification? And if we're going to talk about cultural factors that affect the family in particular, or crime, does it really make sense to compare black culture in rural Mississippi to urban Detroit to Washington, D.C.? Do we lose something when we talk about black culture in America as a whole? Should we be using a more nuanced approach when we talk about those factors?
Well, I guess you can't overgeneralize. So I guess you do have to be careful. There are blacks in all walks of life and all socioeconomic strata and so forth. So I guess you have to make sure it's clear that you are speaking about a certain element of that culture. I would say, however, that what I'm talking about in terms of some of these behaviors and attitudes is not confined to the black poor. I spend part of the book talking about attitudes towards education, even among the black middle class and the black upper middle class. Sociologists have done studies of middle class black communities. I talk about one done in Shaker Heights, Ohio. And he was investigating why the academic outcomes of middle-class blacks were so different from those and so much further behind those of their white counterparts. And he traced it to culture, to attitudes even among upper-income blacks towards education and learning and schools and so forth. So it's not something that the socioeconomic status or a lower socioeconomic status is confined to that. And that's true also in terms of some of the other areas. I mean, I didn't talk about affirmative action policies in my comments, but I've spoken to very black one percenters, boule groups, and talked about affirmative action, and 9 out of 10 people in the room were convinced that the black upper class and middle class we have today would not exist but for racial preferences. They were convinced of that. Even though, as I demonstrate in the book, affirmative action has not done what it was promised, both in terms of lifting up the black poor and in terms of producing college graduates as promised. We have fewer black college graduates today than we would have had in the absence of affirmative action. Studies have shown that, including one done of California after they ended racial preferences back in the 1990s. Black college graduation rates went up, including in the more difficult fields of math and science. But you do have this mentality that, again, transcends particular class of blacks with regard to some of these policies that have been put forward in the name of helping them.